It is truly a pleasure to be here as part of the PPP Forum, organized by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Let me first thank Jeffrey Hamilton and Tony Bonici for the invitation to organize this event as part of their annual Global Forum. The world's developing countries are facing the dual challenge and opportunity of responding to COVID-19 and building back better as they restore progress towards the 2030 agenda and delivering on climate commitments. COVID-19 has been a deeper, more synchronized, and more widespread shock than any in the history of the World Bank Group as a once-in-a-century disruptive event. It continues to reverberate, causing significant destruction and producing spillovers with regional and global implications. This entails delivering on immediate responses in the relief and restructuring stages while maintaining a line of sight to long-term goals. For developing countries, building back better, therefore, means the pursuit of a greener, more inclusive and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, an existential opportunity that we should not squander. These interrelated elements are critical for developing countries to make sustained progress towards the SDGs in a world where shocks occur more frequently with compounded impacts. At the same time, COVID-19 is spurring profound changes in the way people work and live, and the way economies are organized, highlighting the importance of resilient and inclusive approaches to infrastructure development, the opportunities provided by digital development, the value of well-planned energy transition towards net zero, embedding decarbonization in transportation, and the role of effective government and governance and long-term asset management. The reality is that we need more investment in sustainable and quality infrastructure going forward, along with more resilient frameworks and enabling environment. This clearly calls for ramping up private sector participation to help close the financing gap through PPPs and the crowding in of commercial financing, where they can help achieve development goals and reserving scarce public finance for where it is most needed. So the private sector must be a key part of the response, and it is important to understand how the crisis impacted private participation in infrastructure. The World Bank has held several rounds of discussion on the results of the private participation in infrastructure, or what we call the PPI report, which suggests alarming results with a stunning drop in private participation in infrastructure. This drop, which has been more than 50% last year, is unprecedented since we started tracking the data more than 30 years ago. Can this trend be reversed going forward? This session will discuss exactly this conundrum. The private sector must serve as a partner and a major source of financing the transition to a green, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure needs of the developing Europe and Central Asian economies or countries. We have invited a diverse panel to respond to this critical question and have this very timely discussion. Allow me now just to mention few requests to the audience. Please mute your microphones throughout the session. We welcome your questions on the chat box, and we will moderate the questions live. So please post at your convenience. It is now my pleasure to welcome our panelists. Our first panelist is Fatuma Ibrahima. Fatuma is the practice manager of the PPP group of the World Bank Infrastructure Finance PPPs and Guarantees Department. She was previously operations advisor of the Infrastructure and Urban Development Hub in Singapore. Since joining the World Bank more than 20 years ago, Fatuma has worked in several sectors, including finance and the energy sectors, and worked in multiple locations. Our second panelist is Paul Darita. Paul is a senior health consultant with the PPP Transaction Advisory Team at the International Finance Corporation, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, having previously led the Global Head PPP Advisory Team. He focuses primarily on emerging markets, supporting teams in complex health PPP transactions globally. Paul has worked with many public and private sector organizations in delivering innovative and complex health PPP projects across the world over the last 20 years. Our third panelist will be Edwin Lau. Edwin is the head of division in the infrastructure and procurement division in the governance at OECD. Edwin has over 25 years of experience in public sector modernization with a focus on budgeting, digital transformation, and performance management. As the former head of the OECD Budgeting and Public Expenditures Division, he led the infrastructure governance work before the creation of the Division on Infrastructure and Public Procurement, preparing the way for the newly adopted OECD recommendation on the governance of infrastructure. And last but not least, our fourth panelist is Laura Kamininova. Laura is the State Expert Economic and Social Policy Directorate within the administration of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Bulgaria. She is currently working at the Economic and Social Policy Directorate. Laura supports the Directorate's activity on the monitoring of the application of the requirements for the award of concessions, as well as the activity of the Concessions Coordinating Council. Laura had participated in the preparation of the National Concessions Development Strategy of the Republic of Bulgaria and in drafting of the legal acts in the field of concessions. Let us now start our panel, and for that I would like to hand over to my colleague Fatuma, where Fatuma will be presenting the state of play of the private sector investment in infrastructure trends and benchmarks for PPPs in developing Europe and Central Asia's region. Fatuma, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Imad. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished panelists. I'm really happy to be here today to discuss the role of the private sector in building back better. For that, I would like to maybe talk about 2 or 3 things. On the next slide, I would like to mention the 3 pillars of my presentation. One on the trends, the second on the regulatory framework and institutional arrangements, and third on World Bank support since the crisis. So on the next slide, as you can see, I think it's important for us to start, as we're talking about building back better, to start from the crisis. And what we have seen since the crisis is that we have used actually artificial intelligence to track COVID-19 operational disruptions in real time in energy, transport, water, and ICT sectors. And the results have helped us realize that, as you can see, there has been significant disruptions in infrastructure. And this is due to the fact that projects post-financial closure and projects in pipeline have reported delay due to the crisis. So this monitoring showed about 300 projects were cancelled or delayed in emerging and developing economies due to COVID. And the next slide shows the reasons behind these operational disruptions, including financial constraints. Of course, this is the first time we're seeing both public and private sector resources being delayed or constrained, low demand projections, as we saw in transport, government budget reallocation, regulatory changes, and so on and so forth. Where we wanted to really bring information is on the result of the PPI database, which many of you are familiar with on the next slide, which was created by the World Bank to identify and disseminate information on private participation in infrastructure projects in low and middle income countries. So we look at projects that have 20% of their PPI contracts that have reached financial close. And as Imad has mentioned, we have been tracking these numbers since 1990. So we have 30 years of information. And when we look at the results globally, and on the next slide, what we have seen is a significant drop, 52% since last year. This is unprecedented. We have never seen a drop of this nature during the past 30 years. And 3 regions have been mostly impacted. The first is East Asia, where the crisis has started, the Latin America and the Caribbean region, mostly in the context of travel and tourism. And then we have the Europe and Central Asia, where we saw investment commitments dropping by 42%. And this is really important to set the stage for the next conversations. And when we look at closely the results for the ECA region, what we see is that ECA's investment level decreased by 42%, as mentioned, but PPI investments in the region, as you can see in the next slide, is the fact that a number of countries like Turkey and Russia tend to drive the PPI agenda of the region. And when we have been seeing significant decrease in these 2 countries, the fall in Turkey's PPI in recent years can be partly explained by the economic environment, the records of consecutive quarters of falling economic growth, and in Russia, the falling oil prices and the COVID-19 contraction have contributed to this very significantly. So based on that, what we have also looked at are the trends by sector. And you can see in orange on the left-hand side of the next slide, how the transport sector has been impacted. And in the blue, the energy sector. Very few when it comes to infrastructure from other sectors, except to some extent, some municipal solid waste. We can also see, the part of Turkey and Russia in the distribution of PPI in Europe and Central Asia. So PPI in the ECA region, with the exception of 2015, in which we've seen major airports where PPI has spiked, the private investment commitments were channeled a lot by the energy sector. Other countries with significant PPI include, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, Bulgaria, and a few others. On the next slide, what we are really looking at is the PPI in renewable power projects in ECA, which gives some hope in terms of, despite the pandemic, we continue to see the long-term effect of the renewable. What we have seen really is that the pandemic does not seem to have affected the longer-term shift towards renewable energy. So where there has been investment, there is also commitment of countries to invest in renewable. So what you see here on this graph for the ECA region in light green is the information from 2011 to 2015, and on the darker green, 2016, 2020, and you can see the increased nature of the renewable agenda. So ECA is the region with the second highest renewable rate at 64%, and it is mainly led by Russia and Ukraine. With the exception of Armenia and Bosnia, renewable rate of ECA countries is above 50%. And another observation we've made based on the data is onshore wind has added the largest portion of new generation capacity in the ECA region, followed by hydropower. So these are important findings from the data, but the data is also needs to be complemented by qualitative information and where we are really on the regulatory framework, on the institutional arrangements when it comes to the region's performance on PPPs. And we have, many of you are familiar with our benchmarking infrastructure report, where we measure the regulatory framework and the institutional arrangements, not only for PPPs, but this year we have included the traditional procurement of infrastructure. And the benchmarking infrastructure development measures the regulatory quality to prepare, to procure, and to manage PPPs. And in the past 2 years, what we've seen is 50 countries introduce regulatory changes in their legal framework to adopt good international practices in the preparation, procurement, and management of PPP contracts. In particular, we observe that the project preparation phase in general, and you can go to the next slide, John. We observe that the project preparation phase in the area where more countries, actually 33 countries, have introduced changes to adopt good international practices. So these improvements help address one of the crucial barriers identified by the private sector, which is the lack of pipeline of well-prepared projects to consider for investment. So this is important. On the next slide, we can see where we see PPPs and traditional procurement of infrastructure results, and clearly the issue of project preparation continues to be an issue. So higher income levels brings better performance with preparation. The area where we see most room for improvement, and you can see from on the blue chart for PPPs where you can compare the high income countries to the upper middle income, low income, and lower income and low income countries when it comes to preparation, procurement, contract management. We also look at USPs, and the average that you see in the orange bubbles will give you the average of where we stand for each group of country. On the next slide, which is more specific to the regulatory quality for PPPs and how it compares to TPI, we can again see the importance of project preparation and the fact that there is really room for improvement when it comes to contract management, which is the last part of this graph on the right-hand side. And you can see clearly the 55 number, which is the lowest on this chart, and shows the importance to really push on project preparation. The next slide is focusing more on the ECA region performance in PPP regulatory quality when compared to other regions. And we can see that it comes next when compared to OECD high-income countries. But when it comes to areas for improvement, what we see here is really the need for implementation of contract management requirements for the ECA region. So this gives us a little bit the context, both on the trends and on the regulatory aspects of PPPs. But what have we done in terms of responding to client needs? We have continued, as you can see in the next slide, to support through a wide range of data and tools and services that are crucial to PPPs and also are supportive of our agenda to maximize finance for development, to mobilize private capital. Clearly, these interventions will be implemented in parallel or together with our lending and technical assistance support, which could be development policy loan, investment projects, technical assistance. But what we would like to highlight on this slide is our support to countries from upstream to downstream. So on the upstream side, the policy and regulatory framework, which as we could see earlier in the presentation, are critical elements for support. And we have developed a number of tools on infrastructure data, as the one that we have mentioned earlier, the institutional benchmarking on how to procure PPP projects, the PPP certification training, the PPP disclosure tools, and we are receiving more and more requests from countries to get support on how they measure the fiscal risk of PPP projects. And this has been very important in the context of the crisis. The second area is on the infrastructure planning and prioritization, which clearly will be impacted by the crisis. Thirdly, project preparation and structuring, and transaction support and contract management. And alongside that support, we also have a number of funding sources, one being the Global Infrastructure Facility, which supports multiple MDBs, PIAF, the Public-Private Investment Advisory Facility, and the Quality Infrastructure Initiative, which Imad has alluded to earlier. So since the crisis, as Imad has mentioned, we are looking at the long-term goals, but we also needed to come to the countries with immediate response. And on the next slide, we can see what that rapid response involved when it comes to countries' PPP programs. And here, the first aspect of the support was really to help countries take stock of PPPs at all stages under different potential stress scenario. And the second step was to review PPP contractual provisions to make sure that they help in terms of potential response to COVID-19 related disruptions. Step 3 is to assess the fiscal impact, as mentioned earlier. And lastly, propose possible actions at the PPP project or portfolio level. And actually what it meant for us as a group of practitioners is that we needed to adjust the way we respond to countries, not only in terms of instrument, in terms of tools, but also in terms of approach. And the next slide can give us a little bit on the highlights of how we have helped countries almost respond in a just-in-time manner. So in addition to the rapid response program that I have just described to support countries in mobilizing resources to diagnose, the risks and find potential solution, we have created a global PPP community forum in which several countries' PPP units participate, and this has been launched at the very onset of the pandemic to create a platform allowing public sector officials to exchange on real-time issues that they are facing. So we initially had a series of conversations at the regional level, and we held one for the ECA region to allow deeper and broader conversations and also relationships with our clients with an objective to identify and support peer-to-peer exchanges. And that the platform is very has been thriving over the past months in terms of sharing information among peers. And of course, I've mentioned earlier, we put in place a system to track operational disruptions since the crisis, and we have supplemented this with our PPI data to have a better understanding of where we stand on the crisis. So I'm going to stop here and maybe share my last slide, which really is a call to all of us in the development community, and stress the fact that the PPI has slumped due to COVID-19, and this is really a wake-up call that we need to do more to address some of the underlying issues and bring private participation back on track. So for us to be able to build back better, we also need to bring private sector contribution at a higher level. Thank you very much, and happy to follow up later with questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatuma. So now we move on to our next panelist, Paul Derrida. And Paul will present what steps can the government take to green the health sector PPP projects, which are both inclusive and bankable. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jyoti. I hope everyone can hear me and hopefully see the slides on your screen. So I'm going to talk about some of these issues that Jyoti just mentioned from a health perspective. So my focus is very much on healthcare. I work in healthcare PPPs, so that's very much the slant that I will bring to the discussion. And maybe just to put it all into a little bit of context, what we see, of course, is that hospitals are in their own right substantial buildings that consume a lot of resources, and in most cases more resources than typical commercial buildings, and produce certainly more waste than comparable commercial buildings. So they can play a substantial part in both using energy, for instance, but also in polluting the environment if the waste is not handled properly. The buildings, of course, are also intensively used. So we know that most healthcare buildings, to some extent, will be used 12, 16, 24 hours a day. We also know that they house equipment and products that can be harmful to the environment. So anything from radioisotopes, which can be radioactive, through to clinical waste, pharmaceutical waste, which again can be hazardous if not disposed of properly. And hospitals, of course, are also, as I mentioned, energy hungry. And up until recently, not always designed with energy efficiency in mind. Historically, for sure, the focus has been very much on cost rather than green or sustainable. And I think that's both from a public sector affordability standpoint, but also from a financing point of view. So looking on this slide, looking briefly at what it is that maybe the public and private sectors can do to improve sustainability and to improve the way these buildings function, both in terms of their environmental impact, but also in terms of their inclusivity. So from a design standpoint, of course, people talk a lot about green buildings, but what does that mean when it comes to hospital? It can mean a number of different things, but certainly some of the trends that we are seeing in hospital design is a move away from things like intensive artificial ventilation and much more into maximizing daylight and natural ventilation within the actual design of the buildings. We're also seeing an increase push towards digitization, and I think that's important because it allows for a release of space within the building, so therefore we can start to plan, design and build smaller buildings, because actually we don't need as much space because we can be more efficient. So for example, if we have electronic medical records within the hospital, we can save anywhere between 10 and 15% of the space of a typical build because we don't have to store paper records anymore. We're also seeing a trend towards standardizing. So design standardization, I think, is becoming more important because it makes construction cheaper and more efficient, and actually makes operational planning also more efficient and therefore easier and more sustainable. One of the things that IFC has done and is doing as part of its advisory business is that it has developed an accreditation tool. It's called EDGE, and it allows projects to plan their design in a much more efficient way. That tool can be used on not just health projects, but of course, we from an advisory standpoint use it on all of our health projects now, and the private sector is expected to use that tool and become accredited through that tool, so that we know we're getting the most efficient design from a cost perspective and a sustainability perspective as well. On the construction side of things, we are beginning to see lots of new modular construction techniques, whereas in the past we've seen on-site construction from beginning to end. We're now seeing hospital modular construction become much more important and much more visible. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and again can play a part in renewable, more renewable and more sustainable buildings. We're seeing an increased awareness of building in more energy efficiency into hospital buildings, more waste segregation and disposal. Again, waste disposal becomes very expensive. Clinical waste in particular is expensive to dispose of. So by having efficient waste segregation, again, we can cut the cost and the energy implications of waste disposable significantly by segregating that waste properly. And one of the benefits that we see certainly from things like PPPs is that there is a clear link between the initial construction and the long-term maintenance of the assets. And I think that again helps to create a more sustainable and a more efficient building going forward. At the center of all of these things, of course, should be the patients, both in terms of how we design and how we construct hospitals. We should always have the patient at the center of all of the activities. So the flows around the hospital should be centered on patients. The operational systems should be focused on patients. And there is actually some evidence that suggests that a well-maintained hospital can actually have a positive impact on the wellness of patients in hospitals. So again, linking that long-term maintenance that you get from PPP to the construction of the building can actually create a positive impact for the patient. And of course, we're also seeing a bigger push towards the use of things like telemedicine, which again should be able to minimize the amount of space that we need in hospitals. So moving on very quickly, just a couple of examples, 4 examples of recent IFC projects where we are beginning to embed some of the things that I've just talked about. 2 of these hospitals have actually reached commercial close. So Bosa Hospital in Colombia has reached commercial close, and the Uzbekistan dialysis centers has also reached financial close. And we're now working on the early stages of a hospital program in Uzbekistan and an emergency hospital in Lviv, Ukraine, where again we will be bedding in some of the aspects that I just talked about, from the design through to construction and operation of the hospitals. Just touching briefly on some of the things that we've seen that the pandemic has brought about in terms of changes and impacts. And I think that the first thing to say is that what the pandemic has done across the world, not just in developing countries, but also in developed economies, it has shone a spotlight on the lack of resilience in many healthcare systems, and in particular, the facilities within those systems, so hospitals and other healthcare infrastructure. But it has also given us the opportunity to start to think a bit more about how we provide healthcare in the future, and in particular, what type of flexibility we might need to deal with things like future pandemics. And as a result of that, we're beginning to see some countries, at least, beginning to look at separating functions that historically have been provided in hospitals, and thinking about whether it makes sense to separate the emergency activity in some of those settings from the elective or non-urgent activity. So for instance, we're beginning to see some countries look at bringing out of the hospital the diagnostic facilities, so imaging facilities and lab facilities, and placing them in other settings so that the non-urgent cases can be seen without having to go into a hospital setting. Because one of the things we've seen during the pandemic is that many hospitals have had to almost stop entirely all of their non-COVID activity because of either risk of infection or just inability to provide flexibility in their staffing models. And the last point here is that most countries, in fact, I think all countries, are recognizing that more investment will be required into healthcare infrastructure. And whether that's through PPPs or some other method, what is clear is that the private sector will have to play a role within that, because there is not the capacity within the public sector to finance all of that. And then my last slide is really about improving the bankability of projects, whether they be green projects or not. Actually, I think this applies across the board, and I think certainly my observations will resonate with some of the points that we've already heard in the previous presentation. And certainly my experience suggests that sustainability as a concept, or indeed as an active element to a project, is not a hindrance to bankability. In fact, what we're seeing is that as financiers become more attuned to ESG issues, we see them much more interested in sustainability. So actually, we expect that to become much more a part of normal due diligence for financiers. project selection and preparation, I think, as it has already been highlighted, really are critical to moving projects along. I think what I see when I talk to financiers, both institutional investors and commercial banks, is that there is a pool of financing available, chasing actually quite, relatively few well-prepared projects. So I think spending a little bit of time and effort in preparing projects properly will, I think, result in more financing becoming available. And of course, as a lot of countries, particularly the lower income countries, start to struggle with affordability in terms of investment, I think people like the World Bank and others can play a significant part in looking at blended finance solutions, or indeed other de-risking structures that will leverage in more private finance. And my last point is really about a plea really to the public sector to focus and invest a little bit more time in capacity in their own people. Again, we see that as being something that hasn't until now been a potential blocker in getting some of these projects off the ground. Happy to take questions further on down the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Now we will hear from Edwin from OECD.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. So Edwin will share with us some lessons learned from OECD's experience on the green transition and how developing countries can draw on such lessons to start this transition process. Over to you, Edwin.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. I have to say that even though Paul and I did not speak before this presentation, that my remarks lead very well from his final plea. And I think that it's quite important that we do not look at infrastructure financing as being public versus private, but rather at that interface between the public and the private sectors. And if we can improve the overall selection and management of public sector infrastructure, we will crowd in the private sector financing. And I think that's a very important message for all of us to keep in mind. The sustainability, going back to SDG 9, of infrastructure projects is going to depend on the governance of infrastructure. This has been the conclusion of the work that we've been doing on infrastructure governance. And even though we began this work kind of in a pre-COVID period, the events of COVID-19 have only proven this to be more true than ever. In particular, it's because we have to look at the infrastructure life cycle in order to understand the dynamics of infrastructure investment. We all know that governments want to be able to cut the ribbon and be able to announce the big projects because that is what draws attention. And yet over the life cycle, that is both how we are going to deliver on the benefits of the infrastructure project, as well as how we are going to ensure the resilience of those infrastructure assets through the good maintenance and operations of them. And Imad and myself are both working with the G20 on an initiative to look at how strengthening the maintenance of infrastructure will improve its returns over the life cycle. So what this means is that governments should not back away. They should not say, this is really for the public sector to take the lead, the private sector to take the lead. Governments need to step up and take that leadership role in linking infrastructure planning and delivery to achieving their strategic government objectives. This has always been sort of the mantra of the OECD, but now as we start looking at the transition to a decarbonized economy, we see that that government leadership is more important than ever in terms of setting the direction and for a decarbonized economy. Secondly, infrastructure governance is also helping us to think about a whole of government coordination across the entire life cycle. So just as an example, if we look at what governments in OECD countries are now doing in terms of putting in place nature-based solutions, this requires strong coordination between central governments, both vertically with subnational levels of government, as well as horizontally across sectors. So for example, you may think that planting trees in a adjoining water basin is going to improve the water quality that's serving a municipal area. This can be a completely different jurisdiction, and so therefore outside of the infrastructure planning of a particular region or municipality. And so how do we make sure that all of those different actors, whether they are public, private, or different jurisdictions, are working together? These are core infrastructure governance issues. Thirdly, as has been mentioned by some of the other speakers, the current COVID recovery packages, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to set the direction for a green pathway. When we look at OECD countries, over 70% of those who have passed their recovery plans have included infrastructure as a major component of their COVID-19 recovery. Once the resilience and recovery facility plans are all submitted in Europe, that will be an even higher number. And we're already starting to see countries coming to the OECD saying, we have these ambitious objectives, we have the financing available, over 600 billion from the European Commission, but how do we make this work? How are we going to see this transition through? And so we know that governments can't do it alone. They require the capacity, the coherence, the clear direction to get the signals and incentives right, so that the private sector can target its investments properly in support of these objectives. What we've seen is that environmental and climate change goals are critical in order to set the direction. When we look at this survey for the monitoring of the OECD recommendation on infrastructure governance, we can see at the bottom of the chart that sort of the marginal steps that need to be taken, such as upgrading and retrofitting existing infrastructure or improving resource efficiency in construction, those are sort of taken into account. Maybe you might think of that as perhaps the low-hanging fruit. Research and development was mentioned by much fewer countries in terms of being able to stimulate the innovation that's required to green infrastructure. Now, what we found a bit curious is that all countries say that they have key projects in place to support the broader sustainability infrastructure, whether that's hydrogen refueling or whether that's renewables. And yet the number of examples that we're seeing about how this is being linked back into the overall infrastructure planning is still few and far between. And then going back to the issue about the need for the cross-sector coordination, once again, we're seeing this being mentioned in terms of cross-sector synergies to minimize negative impacts. And yet only about half of OECD countries have some sort of broad cross-cutting infrastructure strategy that takes into account both green and sustainable objectives as part of its infrastructure planning. So in terms of developing those key enablers for the implementation of a broader government sustainability initiative, you have to have the direction coming from the top. There's no way of getting around that. Secondly, thinking about how those investments in upgrading and retrofitting existing infrastructure can also support the greater resilience. And so we're seeing in a number of European countries, be it France or Portugal, that this is a key component of trying to get the infrastructure funding out the door and starting to have an impact in our economies. But the greater alignment is still needed in terms of ensuring the environmentally sustainable implementation of projects. We're working with 4 different European countries right now to help them think about how they can have a more sustainable and green infrastructure strategy. And yet in each of these cases, they're still thinking about how do they reduce the carbon footprint of the infrastructure plans, not how they can develop the longer term enabling environment that will be required to completely transform their economies. I know that the interest of this audience is primarily on PPPs, so I wanted to say something about that, and yet in a way, my goal was to learn from all of you, because PPPs are playing a relatively small part of infrastructure financing in OECD countries. In fact, 2/3 of OECD countries report that they have 0 to 5% of their infrastructure is delivered through PPPs. Yet we also see that PPP projects have a greater use of value for money preparation than traditional infrastructure projects. So there is a question of what can we learn from this in terms of thinking about how to apply the existing methodologies and criteria to our infrastructure planning for more sustainable and green infrastructure. So going back to my initial point, thinking about that interface between the public and private sectors, if we start with what the private sector is asking for in terms of financing infrastructure projects, of course, they want the clear objectives. What is it that governments hope to achieve? Secondly, they want infrastructure decisions that are based on quality criteria. Or they will need this in order to be able to incorporate resilience and sustainability objectives into the initial infrastructure bid, and not simply providing infrastructure at the lowest cost. Thirdly, they need policy coherence. If they're getting different messages by jurisdiction or by sector, they don't know who to listen to. But in the end, sort of the basics are still quite important in terms of our risk allocation and management. If the private sector can ensure a reasonable return on its investment commensurate with the level of risk that it is taking, it's going to make the investment. So it's up to the public sector to be able to ensure that those risk management policies are in place. As I mentioned, alignment of incentives and returns, and finally, a predictable policy and regulatory framework. And so I think that the benchmarking that Fatuma was talking about is quite important, because this is what provides the environment for the private sector to make investments. And yet the investment in innovation is probably where the public sector needs to really think about how it can lead private sector investments in the needed innovation for transformation. So what does that mean in terms of private or public sector action? Thinking about how we link infrastructure planning with environmental objectives. A lot of what we've been doing is working with ministries of environment or centers of government that are responsible for the SDG objectives to think about how they can better link the achievement of those objectives to their domestic infrastructure planning. Secondly, ensuring that green criteria are adequately included in the prioritization and appraisal of infrastructure planning. This I would like to say that OECD countries are much more advanced than the rest of the world, but it's not the case. And so these methodologies are only now being developed. Thirdly, promoting the vertical and horizontal coordination between stakeholders and identifying opportunities and challenges from promoting nature-based solutions. As I've said, infrastructure governance is now in a green environment needed more than ever, not just to promote return on investment, but also to ensure these far-reaching and ambitious objectives. And then finally, using the power of public purchasing to foster sustainability. So here we can see how beyond spending, governments can use the public purse and use their procurement policies to support responsible business conduct. And then finally, building capacity and providing the practical tools to invest in green. And here, I think that a number of initiatives out there, from the World Bank's PEMPAL to the OECD's Central Eastern and Southeastern European Senior Budget Officials Network, or the Astana Hub in Kazakhstan, are all examples of how the sharing of information between practitioners is the only way in which people can not only integrate the objectives that they're trying to achieve, but also learn from one another. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Edwin. Now we move on to Laura as our last panelist.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you. So Laura will share with us Republic of Bulgaria's experience in managing its PPP activity and share with us some lessons learned for other countries who are preparing to go to the market to attract the private sector. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present the experience of Bulgaria acquired in managing PPP in the conditions of health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic, particularly concerning the Sofia Airport Works concession, a project which is seen as a successful one practice in managing PPP in this crisis. I would like to note that in the concession project preparation, the Bulgarian state was assisted and advised by the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, in cooperation with the EBRD. The concession award procedure was initiated in July 2018, and after a highly competitive procedure, a concessionaire was designated in July 2019, before the announcement of the pandemic. A concession contract was concluded in July 2020 after a prolonged appeal, in a situation of already announced pandemic and radically different from the one envisaged at the moment, at the time of submitting the bid. The contract parties didn't have the right to modify the contract before its conclusion due to the requirements of the Concession Act. In order for the concession to start effectively till July 2021, a number of preconditions were envisaged to be met, including payment of an initial remuneration due by the concessionaire. The significantly changed situation in the air transport sector, in which the concessionaire had to take over the management and operation of the airport, and the serious disturbance of the economic balance of the concessions led to a risk of termination of the contract. Relevant actions were taken in order to prevent this risk. On a reasoned proposal of the private partner, negotiations were held to modify the contract. The public partner, which is the Ministry of Transport, Information Technology and Communication, engaged the international finance corporations to prepare a financial and economic analysis of the concessionaire's proposal. The strengths and weaknesses of all other possible alternatives for the development of Sofia Airport had been in-depth studied, including the development of the airport without concessions and the opportunity to a new award procedure to be conducted. The estimations showed that the realizations of the concession contains indisputable advantages for the Bulgarian side, enabling it to transfer the risk of asset management to a professional operator, guarantee revenues to the state budget, and enable the state to focus its efforts in other sectors of the economy. A supplementary agreement that restores the concession's economic balance was concluded in the beginning of this month, and it envisages postponement of the payments of the annual remunerations due by the concessionaires for the first 10 years of the contract term, and also updating the investment program, including in connection with investments to improve environmental, health and safety conditions. After the modification, the overall investments amount in the end of the concessions terms is not decreased, but even increased by something like 17 million euros. The modification of the contract allows the feasibility and viability of the concession, as well as sustainable development, financing and management of Sofia Airport, the strategic goals, and the feasibility and viability of the concession derives from the well-prepared contract, which has provided mechanisms for restoring the economic balance of the concession, allows flexibility and the ability to adapt to the new conditions. Just recently, on 19th of April, the concessionaire have taken over the full responsibilities and business activities related to the operation of the airport, and the start of the concessions is already a fact. We have another one experience, but not a good one for the moment. This is about the Plovdiv Airport concession. The concession award procedure of this airport initiated in March 2020, just before the pandemic announcement. The deadline for submitting applications and tenders has been extended 5 times, but no such applications have been submitted and the procedure is likely to be terminated. The reasons for this will be further analyzed, but maybe the project is suffering from shortcomings, not only because of the change situation in the air transport sector. So, in the lessons we have learned from these 2 airport concessions are that flexible mechanisms for the adaptation to extraordinary events should be provided during the preparation of PPP projects. The participation of international consultants who are trusted by both the public sector and the private sector is a good practice in preparation of major infrastructure PPP projects because their participation contributes to quality and comprehensive project preparation. Of course, the PPP continues to be seen as the most adequate tool to overcome the effects of this crisis. Concerning the question for the green infrastructure projects, we cannot say that concrete actions has been taken to promote concessions with such green indicators. Therefore, we also express interest in foreign experience on this topic. What I can say that according to the Concessions Act, the Bulgarian Concession Act introduces the possibility to determine as award criteria measures above the normative ones for environmental protection as well as energy efficiency. But this possibility can be used by the grantors at their discretion. So this is our experience so far with the 2 airport concessions. Thank you very much.
Very much, Laura. This was very complementary to the earlier presentations made by other panelists, and I very much appreciated the emphasis on the Sofia airports, of course, but also the real case example of delay really resonates with the earlier presentations. So, colleagues, we have 2 minutes to go. Allow me to maybe recap and give a couple of concluding remarks, building on the last intervention from Laura, which really gives us the perspective of the client countries and the constraints that they are facing, but also the good and more challenging experiences. Paul's presentation was extremely helpful in terms of what can the public and the private sector do to improve sustainability in the health sector in terms of design, construction, patient-centered approach, and of course the edge excellence in design for greater efficiencies is something that he has mentioned en passant, but is extremely important in the context of this work. Edwin has highlighted sustainability and its link to governance of infrastructure and life cycle approach to it in terms of the government leadership, whole of government coordination, life cycle were all extremely insightful. Sometimes those lessons are taken for granted, but very often to go back to basics, right? And of course the greening infrastructure element came across most of the presentations. So that being said, I would like to really conclude by saying that the COVID-related macroeconomic turbulence and the poor economic outlook continue to make private sponsors and financiers reluctant, and we just need to be aware of it. The fallout of the pandemic raises concerns about credit quality, borrowers' liquidity, financial robustness. In some cases, the fragility of the regulatory environment in developing countries is an issue. However, today we need good infrastructure more than ever. So we saw the example in Egypt. And connectivity, strong logistics, municipal solid waste are all crucial to fighting the pandemics. Sectors such as energy, transport are essential. And longer term concerns for which infrastructure is a key part of the solutions. And we need to think about the rapid urbanization, the climate change, which loom prominently on the horizon. So I would like to really take the opportunity to thank everyone. I wish we could go through another round to ask for last questions, but unfortunately we're bound by the 1 hour constraint. So on that, I would like to thank all the panelists and the great participation of colleagues who stayed during the entire session. Thank you very much to all of you, and see you soon, and hopefully at the World Bank.
Thank you, Fatuma. Over to you, Claudio.
Thank you very much, everyone. Congratulations to all the speakers and comments. Great to see you, and hope to have another opportunity to cooperate in the future and work together. Thank you very much, Jyoti.
Yes, Jyoti, let me just thank you as well. I really felt that was very pertinent, and something we should have had really right at the beginning of the session. I can't resist the healthcare. I had a very, very dear mother who died in hospital. She went in relatively badly, relatively okay, but she got an infection. And I'm terrified of these hospitals as super spreaders of infections and COVID, and I'm wondering whether care in the community is probably a way to go in the future, particularly if we're going to face COVID and other pandemics in the future. I think that debate is going to be done somewhere else, Paul, but I really appreciated also all your thinking on the structure of hospitals and care. That is very important. And I also for the UN, we're very worried about the social inequalities and the fact that the COVID has had a disproportionate impact on ethnic groups, minorities, women, and so on. And so the kind of response might be a wee bit more effective if we look at social infrastructure, more healthcare, and maybe less roads. These are just small things, but I think it would be great for the World Bank and UN to have a good discussion on these topics. And of course, Jyoti, and just to give you a wee bit more than an hour, because you've done a fantastic job in the time allocated. So thank you very much.
Jeffrey, and thanks, Claudio. Thanks also to UNAC for extending the invitation to the World Bank. We look forward to continuing those conversations. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice